Hello, everybody, and welcome. We're so excited to have you here on this Monday afternoon. Today is the opening webinar in our new series, Literacy is Opportunity, and we have so much to share with you. We're so excited to have you here today. I can see so many people trickling in. I have a little bit of info to share, so I'll let you guys trickle in and share some of that detail. So again, today is the first webinar in our series, Literacy is Opportunity. So we thank you for coming and taking the time to join us. My name is Laura Almazara, and I'm on the literacy team here at Amplify. Today's webinar is going to be recorded, and we'll also email out that recording link for you to rewatch as you'd like a little bit later in the week. Everyone here with us today will also receive a certificate of attendance via email. We have a live captioner with us today, so if you want to access the captions, just be sure to click on live transcript in the bottom tray. Throughout the webinar, if you have any questions, please pop them in the Q&A and we'll try to get to them at the end. And we welcome comments and engagement in the chat. So to start, let's find out where everybody's joining us from. We have a nice February day, so I'm in Phoenix, Arizona, so I'd love to hear people's snow reports. We'll live a little bit in throughout all of you. Oh, we have Alberta. I'm sure there's some snow up there. Oh, fellow Arizonan, welcome. Oh, I got people from all over. This is incredible. Thank you all so much for joining us. I know it's a little bit on the later side for some of you. Just a quick note, as you can see on our slide here, we have lots more webinars scheduled in this series. So if you haven't already signed up for more, please do. Just go to amplify.com/literacy-is-opportunity-series. On Friday, we're leading a panel discussion about shifting away from balanced literacy. And in the next several months, we'll also be sharing insights about why literacy is opportunity, why the best intervention is actually prevention, and why knowledge building remains crucial in middle school, which might be of interest to all you folks here with us today. And thank you again for joining us. We're so excited to have the wonderful Natalie Wexler here with us to talk to us about leveling the literacy playing field with knowledge building. Natalie is an education writer and senior contributor to the education channel on Forbes.com, and she's also the author of the incredible book, The Knowledge Gap, The Hidden Cause of America's Broken Education System and How to Fix It. Welcome and thank you for being here today, Natalie. Oh, looks like you're muted, Natalie.
I am muted. You'd think I'd know by now, but thank you, Laura. I'm delighted to be here. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and plunge right in because I have a lot to cover. I am going to try to leave time for questions at the end, but might not happen. Leveling the literacy playing field with knowledge building. We are not hearing that much lately in the media about the importance of building knowledge to literacy. What we are hearing a lot about the science of reading. This has really been all over the media. You've probably seen these articles. There was a cover story in Time magazine and lots of coverage in the New York Times. And a lot of this coverage has been sparked by the wonderful audio documentaries from APM Reports and Emily Hanford, going back to 2018, with this Sold a Story being the most recent. And if you have not listened to those, I highly recommend them. But there is one word that keeps coming up in this coverage: phonics. And you can read some of these stories, many of these stories, and think, well, that's really all we need to do to line up our literacy instruction to the science of reading and help level the playing field for lots of kids who need systematic phonics instruction. Now, systematic phonics instruction, don't get me wrong, is crucial. Many, if not most kids, need that kind of instruction in order to become fluent readers. And it's not just phonics, there's also phonemic awareness, which is hearing the sounds in words and being able to manipulate them. And that helps with phonics, which is connecting those sounds like cat to the word cat, to be able to read the word cat. But of course, comprehension is also crucial. It doesn't help you to read the word cat if you don't know what a cat is. So I'm going to be focusing on that comprehension side. Now, science of reading infographics do, of course, mention comprehension, as do many of these news reports. They mention that it's important. You may have seen this infographic, Simple View of Reading, and it says right there, language comprehension. And you may have seen this 5 Pillars of Early Literacy infographic, which is drawn from the National Reading Panel report. And this is often used to define the science of reading, these 5 components or pillars. And you see comprehension is right there. But of course, infographics are meant to be simple. And these infographics were really created to show that, well, it's not just decoding. There are these other components, but simplicity also leaves a lot to interpretation. And it's possible to interpret these in ways that might really not line up with science. Now, there is another infographic that you might have seen that's more complex, the reading rope, or Scarborough's rope, it's sometimes called. And that has different strands that go into language comprehension. But even with this more fleshed out picture of language comprehension, against the background of current practices, you could still conclude that what we are currently doing to foster comprehension lines up with science. So this is what we're going to look at more deeply. Does science tell us we just need more phonics to level the literacy playing field? And this is a message that some people have been getting. But first, let's take a look at the standard approach to teaching reading comprehension in 2 parts. So part 1, so reading comprehension is approached as a set of skills and strategies, and there are a whole bunch of them. This is just one list I found online, but with things like finding the main idea and details of a text, making inferences, comparing and contrasting. Often there will be a skill of the week, and the teacher will model or demonstrate that skill using a text that's chosen not so much for its topic, but rather for how well it lends itself to demonstrating, comparing and contrasting, or whatever the skill is. And then part 2 of this approach is that kids practice the skill or strategy on a text that has been determined to be at their individual reading level. And that could be well below their grade level, but they'll be directed to a basket of books that matches their level. And again, these books in the baskets have been chosen not for their topics, but they're really categorized by things like word length, sentence length. And the theory is that if kids diligently practice a skill like finding the main idea, that they will get really good at it, they'll master it, and they'll be able to apply it to find the main idea, to understand pretty much any text that's put in front of them, whether it's a passage on an end of the year reading test or a textbook down the road in high school. If you're good at finding the main idea, you can find the main idea of a text. So let's test out that theory just briefly. I'm just going to show you a paragraph from a newspaper and ask you to find the main idea. And I'm sure you're all expert readers, so this shouldn't be a challenge. So here goes. Now, if you're like me, you really don't know what this paragraph is trying to tell you. And what I neglected to mention is that I took this paragraph from a British newspaper, and it's describing a cricket match. Now, if you're a cricket fan, you probably have no trouble following this, but if, like me, you don't know anything about cricket, this is impenetrable. And it's not that you can't decode the words. It's not even that you don't understand the individual words, like adjudged leg before, but you don't know what it means to be adjudged leg before. So this is something that cognitive scientists have known about for a long time, the scientists who study reading comprehension. Back in the late 1980s, there was actually a study that has become iconic. And the researchers wanted to know, what is more important in reading comprehension? Is it those general skills like finding the main idea? Or is it how much the reader knows about the topic? And this study has come to be known as the baseball study. Now, they chose the topic of baseball because they were working with 7th and 8th grade kids, and they figured there were a lot of kids out there who were not generally good readers, but they do know a lot about baseball. So they divided these kids into 4 groups, depending on how well they scored on a standardized reading comprehension test and how much they knew about baseball. And then they gave them all a passage to read describing a baseball game. And they tested their comprehension of that passage. And what they found was that what really made the difference was how much you knew about baseball. So these are the kids who were poor readers, according to that test, but they were baseball experts. And they did pretty well. This significantly lower blue line, those are the kids who were the good readers according to the test, but who did not know much about baseball. And as you can see, when the poor readers were reading about a topic they knew a lot about, they did okay, quite well, almost as good as the good readers who knew a lot about baseball. So this is not just one study. This same kind of study has been done in numerous other contexts, and they've always found the same results. Knowledge of the topic trumps general reading skill. And so what these studies show us is that comprehension skills, they're not skills like riding a bike or like decoding words. They don't just get better with practice. It's going to depend to a large extent on the topic and how much the reader knows about the topic. And secondly, I don't know if you can see that, but secondly, it just tells us there's really no such thing as a fixed reading level, individual or grade, because those things don't take account of the topic and the reader's knowledge. And so they're just going to be approximations. Now, this may be pretty obvious with a body of knowledge with its own specialized lingo, like baseball or cricket or molecular biology. If you know the lingo, it's going to be easier to understand a text on that topic. What may be less obvious is that now I'm not advanced, there we go. We draw on background knowledge to understand everything we read, different layers actually of background knowledge, but it's been found, for example, that there's a strong correlation between general academic knowledge, like knowing the answer to in what part of the body does pneumonia occur, and general reading comprehension, which means that sort of the more stuff you know, the higher your chances of understanding pretty much anything that's put in front of you. And that implies that if we want to level that playing field, what we need to do is not have kids practicing these comprehension skills hour after hour, but give all students access to as much academic knowledge and vocabulary as possible. Another factor in comprehension that is often overlooked is familiarity with complex syntax, sentence structure, because the syntax of written language is always more complex than the syntax of spoken conversational language. So it's not just about understanding conversation. There are different structures in written language. And if you're unfamiliar with them, it's going to be a problem. So for example, I came across a study involving a 10-year-old boy who has average decoding ability, but struggled with comprehension. And the researchers in this study read this boy the following sentence: Rachel Carson, a scientist, writer, and ecologist, grew up in the rural river town of Springdale, Pennsylvania. And Rachel Carson, of course, is the author of this book about pesticides. Then the researchers asked the boy, so what do you know about Rachel Carson now? And he replied, they grew up together in the same place. Now, how did he get that answer? Well, he saw these three words, scientist, writer, and ecologist, and thought that was referring to three different people. And according to the researchers, this is not that uncommon. Kids will often look at the nouns that are closest to the verb and assume that they go with the verb, that they're the subject. Because this is not a construction. This is called an appositive, a phrase describing a noun. And it's not something that we use in conversation, but it does appear in written text, especially complex text. And as I said, this is not uncommon. In fact, I just came across another study, long-term, large-scale study. Fewer than 10% of 8th graders can evaluate complex syntax. That's a lot of kids. So this is something we do need to pay attention to. So to illustrate what all of this looks like, how it comes together in real life, I'm going to show you another paragraph from a newspaper article. And this time, it's not going to be about cricket. This time, I'd like you to think about what layers of knowledge you're drawing on to understand the paragraph. And by the way, it's a paragraph, it's from a New York Times op-ed from a few years ago. So it refers to a president, but it is not the current president. So here it goes. So one layer of knowledge that is assumed by this paragraph is some knowledge of the American legal system. You don't need deep knowledge, but you need some familiarity with words like appeal, Supreme Court, ruling, federal appeals court, grand jury, subpoena, district attorney. And this isn't written for lawyers, it's written for the general reader. And it's just assumed you'll have some familiarity with those words. But if you don't, it's going to get harder to understand this paragraph. You may have to look these things up. You just have to think about them, and you're not going to be able to devote as much attention to what this paragraph is trying to tell you. Beyond that, another layer of knowledge here is that general academic vocabulary, like words like capacity, validity, obtained by in the sense of or obtained by or served on in the sense of a subpoena. And then beyond that, there's some complex syntax here, especially that last sentence has a lot of clauses, could really trip you up if you're not familiar with that kind of syntax. And so if you're unfamiliar with those things, you are really out of luck. It's going to be very hard to understand this paragraph. But how do you get that general academic vocabulary and that familiarity with complex syntax? Well, really, it's through knowledge of topics. It doesn't work to try to teach those things in the abstract. So topic knowledge is the root to this general knowledge that we want everybody, all kids, to acquire. So why is that? What is going on in the mind that explains why prior relevant knowledge helps with comprehension? Well, it has to do with that middle box there, working memory. And that's the aspect of our consciousness where we are taking in new information and trying to make sense of it. And the important thing to know about working memory is that it's very limited in its capacity. It can only juggle about 4 or 5 items for maybe 20 seconds before it starts to get overwhelmed and we start to lose the ability to comprehend what we're trying to take in. And that burden on working memory is called cognitive load. And of course, when you're reading, in addition to the information you're trying to take in, you may be, if you're not a fluent reader yet, you're juggling decoding and all sorts of things, that syntax. Now, there's no reliable way to improve the capacity of any individual's working memory, but there is a way around those limitations. And that has to do with long-term memory, that blue box on the right, which is potentially infinite. So if we can just withdraw some prior relevant knowledge that we have stored in long-term memory, we don't have to juggle that in working memory along with the new information. And that gives us more capacity in working memory to make sense of the new information. It expands our ability to understand. So there are a couple of tricks here. One is we first have to transfer new information to long-term memory, and we also have to be able to retrieve it when we need it. What helps with transfer is attaching meaning to new information. And one good way to do that is to explain it to someone else, to talk about it in our own words. Retrieval, the more you practice retrieving an item, the more likely you are to be able to retrieve it when you need it. And there are different ways to practice retrieval, quizzing, but a really effective one is to, explain it to someone in our own words, orally or in writing. And we'll be coming back to that idea. But that's sort of the basic lay of the land, the cognitive architecture, as scientists sometimes say. So what does all this have to do with scores on standardized reading tests? And what brought me to this subject initially, and really a large part of leveling the playing field, I wanted to know why there continues to be such a gap in these test scores between basically kids at the upper and lower ends of the socioeconomic spectrum. And a large part of the reason is that the passages on reading tests, like any written text, make certain assumptions about what the reader already knows. Writers don't explain every word they use, because if they did, no one would want to read their writing. It would be very tedious. And the passages on reading tests are not designed to be related to what kids have learned in school. In fact, they're designed to avoid those topics, because the idea is, well, we're not testing their content knowledge. We're just testing their general ability to find the main idea or make inferences or whatever. But of course, if you don't have enough background knowledge to understand the passage on the test, at least at a superficial level, you don't get a chance to demonstrate your skill at finding the main idea, etc. And to show you what that might look like in real life, I'm going to just show you a paragraph from a standardized, released item from a standardized third grade reading comprehension test. So here goes. Now, to us as educated adults, this paragraph might look pretty straightforward, but there are actually a lot of words and phrases here that many third graders probably don't know. So if you're missing that information, the paragraph starts to look like this, and then it becomes like that cricket paragraph if you don't know anything about cricket. Now, some third graders will know these words and phrases, or many of them, and they tend to be the third graders whose parents have read them books about the Inuit maybe, or taken them to museums and maybe taken them to Alaska. But the other kids, they rely on school for this kind of information. And unfortunately, in our current system, those kids are the least likely to get it there. So why is that? Well, it has to do with the elementary curriculum. So a quick quiz, how much time on average do you think elementary students spend each day on ELA, or reading, math, science, social studies, and the arts? Not to keep you in suspense, this is a chart based on data collected by the federal government on about 7,000 elementary school students. And the average amount of time on ELA is about 2 hours officially, and 30 minutes or so on science and social studies. In fact, I've been in many schools, talked to many teachers who say, well, we have 30 minutes at the end of the day that we're supposed to be doing science or social studies, but often that time gets taken up with reading, math. And that's especially true in schools where test scores are low, because the theory is, well, if we want to get those reading scores up, we need to spend more time on reading and practice those skills that the tests seem to be assessing. But, a couple of researchers looked at this data and they asked, what happens if kids get an extra half an hour a day social studies? And they found that that was correlated with higher reading test scores, especially for kids from low-income families. Then they looked at what happens if kids get an extra half an hour a day on ELA or reading, and they found that that was not correlated with higher reading scores. Now, the study can't tell us why, but one possibility is that through social studies, those kids were getting the knowledge and vocabulary they needed to understand the passages on the reading tests. So in our well-intentioned efforts to raise reading scores, we have maybe been shooting ourselves in the foot. So let's look a little more closely at those kids who are not doing well on reading tests, on these standardized reading tests, and why. Well, we know that the students who score low are disproportionately Black and brown. So this is data from the most recent NAEP reading assessment for 8th graders. So white kids, 38% scored proficient or above on the NAEP, the National Assessment of Educational Progress, which is actually a significant decline from the previous administration, and probably that's an effect of the pandemic. But it's still far above where Black students on average are scoring, only 16% proficient or above, and Hispanic students only about, that says 24 proficient or above. So this is the way this data is often reported in terms of race. One thing that's not often discussed is that, yes, it's true that the students who score low are disproportionately Black and brown, but a lot of white students also score low on these standardized reading tests. This is data from a few years ago, the 4th grade NAEP reading test. There are, in absolute terms, a lot more white kids who are taking the test. And in fact, more white kids do score below proficient than African-American or Hispanic kids in absolute terms. Now, this is not to say that race is unimportant, but if race were the only factor, we wouldn't be seeing this. So there's got to be more factors at work here. And it's important to understand what they are so we can address this problem. So we know another factor is income, poverty. We know that this data doesn't tend to get reported so much this way lately because we're having trouble identifying income level for students because of the way we're collecting this data. But still, this tells us something. The wealthier students, 41% at proficient or above. Again, a decline from the previous administration, but still significantly higher from those who are lower income, from lower income families, only 19% proficient or above. Now, there's another way of slicing this data that we don't often hear about, but it's worth looking at for what it may tell us. And that's level of parental education. So if you look at kids whose parents have graduated, at least one parent has graduated from college, 41% proficient or above. Those who did not finish high school, about 17%. And in fact, it's really the same percentage for those whose parents did finish high school, significantly lower. Now, one thing, so all of these percentages are roughly the same. The kids who are wealthier, the kids who are white, the kids whose parents have graduated from college, they're doing better. But what we don't have is like a cross section here. What would happen if a kid was poor but had highly educated parents? And in our society, they're not going to be very many of those kids, but it could tell us something about what factor we really need to be looking at here if we want to make some progress. So there is some data on that. For example, this is a study from about 10 years ago on kindergarten readiness, kids who are more likely to be ready for kindergarten when they start. And here it is broken down by income. And as you might expect, the kids who were moderate or high income were far more likely to be ready for school at age 5 than kids who came from poorer families. But the researchers also sliced and diced this data in different ways. And when you isolated parental level of education, you found something interesting. This is kids whose mothers have a BA or above. And when you look at that category, that is the only category where the poor kids are more likely to be ready for kindergarten than the moderate or high income kids. So that suggests that level of parental education is really important here. Now, why am I talking about this? It's not, that we have to make sure that all mothers get a BA or above. I mean, that's going to be difficult, right? But it's important because it tells us what we might be able to do about this right now. So we know children do better on tests and in school generally when they have more academic knowledge and vocabulary. We know children from more highly educated families are going to pick up more of that academic knowledge and vocabulary at home. And that really helps them on those reading tests and in school. We also know schools can do a better job of building academic knowledge and vocabulary for all students. And that's going to help level the playing field. So we should definitely continue to fight racism and poverty, of course, but we also need to start making the system fairer for all kids now by building that academic knowledge and vocabulary that's going to enable them to reach their full potential. So another thing, not just about knowledge helping with comprehension. It does, but as time goes by, these gaps between groups of students get bigger because knowledge, it has been said, is like mental Velcro. It sticks best to other related knowledge. And what that means is the kids who start out with more of that other half of the Velcro, more academic knowledge, they're going to be better able to retain new information from the texts they read. And that in turn enables them to read yet more complex texts. But the other kids who start out with less of that other half of the Velcro are less likely to be able to acquire whatever new information, new vocabulary is in the simpler texts that they are relegated to. And what that means is they're going to fall farther and farther behind their more advantaged peers every year that goes by. This has been called the Matthew effect in reading, a reference to the Gospel of Matthew and the part that says the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. And this is why it's so important to start building academic knowledge early, because the longer you wait, the wider that gap is and the harder it is to narrow. But it can look like that skills and strategies approach is working at lower grade levels, basically because the texts we're asking kids to read at lower grade levels don't assume a whole lot of academic knowledge and vocabulary, generally speaking. But then when they get to upper grade levels and the texts do assume that knowledge, if they don't have it, they hit a wall. So that's one kind of knowledge gap. And then there's a related gap, which is the difference between what we assume high school students know and what many do know. And this can be true even for kids from wealthier families, more highly educated parents, but it is most obvious with kids who are coming from less highly educated families. They can go all the way through middle school without ever getting systematic instruction in history, geography, science, or anything but reading and math. And that can lead them through no fault of their own with very large gaps in their background knowledge. It's not unusual in high poverty high schools for kids to not know things like the difference between a city and a state, or a country and a continent, not to be able to find the United States on a map of the world, not to know much about history, or even have a sense of historical chronology, not because they can't learn these things, but because no one has taught them these things in a way that will stick. And yet we give them textbooks like this and expect them to read and understand them, which can be very frustrating. And the tests, of course, start assuming a lot more knowledge and vocabulary. Just a quick look at a part of a practice item from the SAT, you can see there's a lot of knowledge and vocabulary assumed here that a lot of high school students will not have. So when I stumbled across this problem years ago, our failure to start building knowledge early, I was really surprised because I'd never heard about this. And I thought I knew a lot about education. I'd been writing about it as a journalist. And I thought, well, maybe if someone writes a book about this that takes a sort of engaging narrative approach, it will help get this issue into the public conversation about education. So that's the book I tried to write. And as concerned as I was about this issue when I wrote the book, I'm even more concerned now because we know that with remote and hybrid learning, the very same kids who were not being well served by this system before the pandemic are the ones who bore the most negative impact from remote and hybrid learning. And so we cannot afford to go back to what we were doing before. But I didn't write the book just to describe the problem. I also wanted to know what we can do about it. And the good news is that there is a lot that teachers and schools can do to help level this literacy playing field. So what can individual teachers do? Well, first, organize read alouds by topic, not by skill. So not the skill of the week, but a topic like sea mammals, and spend 2 or 3 weeks at least on a topic, reading a series of books on that general topic, because kids need to hear the same words and concepts repeatedly in different contexts for those things to really stick. Secondly, class discussion. Ask questions that don't put the skill in the foreground. So it's not like, can we make an inference, but put the content in the foreground and implicitly require kids to make an inference or whatever. And I'm going to show you an example of what that can look like, but that's what will work better. Then organize classroom libraries, not just by reading level, but also by topic, especially if it's a topic that you have recently been reading and talking about. Remember that baseball study. If kids already have some background knowledge of the topic, you may be surprised at what level they can read at. So put out a range of levels of difficulty on that topic, different levels of difficulty. Then spending lots of time on social studies and science topics. Of course, fiction, poetry has its place, but remember that social studies, science, those have the most potential to build the kind of academic knowledge and vocabulary that fuel reading comprehension. And then lastly, let's write about what they are learning about. I'm going to talk a little bit more about writing in a few minutes, but I'll just say now, we know from many studies that when students write about what they are learning, it boosts their learning, it boosts their comprehension and retention of that information. But there's a limit to what any individual teacher can do to narrow these knowledge gaps, because knowledge building, we know, is a gradual cumulative process that extends across grade levels, and no teacher can control what's happening at other grade levels. So somebody at a higher level, to really make progress here, somebody at a higher level will need to step in. So what can administrators and policymakers do? Well, one crucial step is to adopt a content-focused elementary literacy curriculum that goes deeply into topics in social studies, science, and the arts, including literature. And the good news is that there are now maybe half a dozen different curricula that do this in different ways, covering different bodies of knowledge, but they all have at least a couple of important things in common. One is they are organized by topic, not skill of the week, and they spend at least 2 or 3 weeks, sometimes more, on a topic. And secondly, they give all students in the classroom access in some way to complex grade level or above text, which is really crucial. that's going to be the way, as I'll explain in a minute, that's going to be the way to both build kids' knowledge and familiarize them with that complex syntax. So a knowledge building curriculum can help level the playing field by modulating that heavy cognitive load that reading and especially writing impose on kids, on many kids. To understand how they can do that, we need to understand that literacy is about more than just reading, and even about more than just reading and writing. It's really about all four of these things. And listening and speaking are different in a crucial way from reading and writing. And that way is that they are easier. We don't have to teach kids to do those things. We have evolved as human beings naturally to do those things. And that means that in themselves, listening and speaking don't impose any cognitive load on working memory, which means there's more space there to take in new information and think about it. So that's why it's important to build knowledge initially through reading complex text aloud and also having students talk about it. Because remember, when you talk about something, when you explain it to someone in your own words, it helps transfer that information to long-term memory. And then once kids have that information about a topic in long-term memory, it can enable them to read and write about it at a higher level because they're not also juggling new information about the topic, and they have more capacity to devote to things like decoding or figuring out where to place the emphasis in a sentence, and of course to the many things that they have to do when they're writing. Now, this only works if they're reading and writing about the same topic they've been listening to and talking about. And unfortunately, our current system doesn't take advantage of this because it has kids maybe listening to a text about sea mammals but talking really about comparing and contrasting, not about sea mammals, and then maybe reading about the solar system and writing about some other topic, maybe personal experience or maybe reptiles. So we're making reading and writing much harder than they need to be for kids. Another way of looking at this is that literacy is going to develop along two different paths that will ultimately converge. So one path is going to be that foundational skills path where kids are getting systematic decoding instruction, reading decodable readers. This is not going to be the way they're developing knowledge in the early years. The other path is where they're developing that knowledge, vocabulary, complex syntax through listening and speaking. And then eventually when their decoding skills catch up to where their knowledge is, they're going to be able to draw on that knowledge to read and write at a higher level. So let's take another look at those infographics. Not that there's anything wrong with them, but their simplicity can leave them open in the current environment to misinterpretations. So what is a possible misinterpretation here? Language comprehension, ability to understand spoken language. Well, that could sound like if you can understand a conversation, you'll be able to understand written text. But reading comprehension requires more than understanding spoken language because it's more complex than spoken language. So that's certainly one possible misinterpretation here. And then here, one possible misinterpretation is if we put all these things in the same basket, it looks like the way to teach comprehension is like it's a skill like phonics, and we know that that's not actually true. Also, not only this infographic, but the report on which it's based, the 500-page report, doesn't say anything about the roles of background knowledge or familiarity with complex syntax. And that's because the National Reading Panel did not ask, well, how can we best help kids understand complex text? They asked a much narrower question. It was, is there evidence that teaching comprehension strategies works? And they did find that evidence, but it doesn't mean that's all you need to do. So let's take a look at this more fleshed out infographic, which is certainly better, but even here, against the background of a lot of assumptions about how to teach comprehension, there's a possibility for misinterpretation. So it does mention background knowledge, but teachers know background knowledge is important. And in fact, one of the comprehension strategies is activating background knowledge. That's great, but it only works if there's relevant background knowledge to activate, and many kids won't have that. Secondly, well, teachers might know that, and so they'll look at a text and they'll think, well, my kids need They don't know these words. I'm going to define these 5 or 6 words for them before we read this. And that could really be great to help kids get through that text. But remember that without repetition, those words are unlikely to stick in long-term memory, so they won't have them available when they read other texts that use them in the future. Now, there's also a mention of vocabulary here, but one possible misinterpretation is to think that these two things are really separate, knowledge and vocabulary, but they're not. They're inextricably linked. You cannot grow vocabulary without also growing knowledge. And then there is a mention of syntax. Doesn't say it's more in written text, but at least it does mention syntax. But it doesn't say that a really great way to build kids' familiarity with complex syntax is actually through writing instruction. I'm going to talk more about that in a moment. But before I get to that, I'd like to tell you about 2 classrooms that I followed through a school year when I was researching the book. And the idea was to compare a classroom that was using that comprehension skills approach to comprehension, the standard approach, with a classroom that was using a knowledge building approach. And at the time that I was doing this, there was only one knowledge building elementary literacy curriculum out there, and that was core knowledge language arts. So these 2 classrooms were not identical. One was 1st grade, one was 2nd grade, but they were pretty similar. All of the kids in both classrooms were from low-income families. They were all children of color. And the teachers in both classrooms were really hardworking, dedicated, good teachers. But what was going on in each of these classrooms was completely different. And the reason for that really was the curriculum, what was being taught. So I don't have video, unfortunately, that I can show you, but I do have pictures of anchor charts that were on the wall, or in this case, on the window, on the blinds. And so this is a typical anchor chart from the skills-focused classroom. They were all about skills, main idea, sequence of events. It was very hard for the teacher to get these kids engaged. These were 6-year-olds. They just didn't have much to say about sequence of events or whatever. This is a typical anchor chart from the content-focused classroom, and obviously it's full of content. This is from a unit on Greek myths, and this is about the myth of Daedalus and Icarus. And these charts would be constructed by the teacher and the students collaboratively during and after every day's read aloud. And the students in this classroom were having amazing, thoughtful discussions. These were 2nd graders, and they were highly engaged. They often did not want the teacher to stop reading the read aloud. They often had their hands still up when it was time for discussion to end. And they were learning a lot. And one of the things they were learning, I'd like to point out on this poster, are vocabulary words that are quite sophisticated. These were the words that were highlighted, the words of the day: desperately, plummeted, and foresight. Now, these would be sophisticated words for any group of 2nd graders. These 2nd graders, most of them came from non-English speaking families, and some were still learning English themselves, and yet they were using words like this in class discussion and in their own conversation sometimes. And these words were lodging in long-term memory to serve them well in years to come. And one reason they're going to remember these words is they are encountering them in a highly engaging context, in very vivid context. So for example, this word plummeted appears down here. Icarus's wings melted and he plummeted into the sea. Another thing to point out here is, as I mentioned, this balance between focusing on content and focusing on skills. It could look like this teacher is teaching skills because she's got this question: predict. What is Daedalus's plan? And these boxes labeled cause and effect, but she is not trying to teach the abstract skill of making predictions or determining cause and effect and bringing in texts to teach the skill. She's bringing in those questions to get kids to think deeply about content, and that is what works. So to return to writing for just a few minutes, because we don't pay enough attention to writing, and it is potentially an incredibly powerful lever for building the kind of knowledge that fuels reading comprehension. Why is that? Well, remember, transfer and retrieval, good ways to do both of those things is explaining something to someone else in your own words. And that's what we do when we write. It helps with both transfer and retrieval. And it's so powerful, it can even compensate for gaps, even at large gaps at higher grade levels. But the problem is it's also the hardest thing we ask students to do. And again, that's because of working memory and cognitive load. Inexperienced writers may be juggling way more than those 4 to 5 items. They may be juggling letter formation, spelling, what word to use, how to organize their thoughts, the content, which is not just one item, understanding the content, and using that peculiar syntax and vocabulary of written language that they may not be familiar with. And all of this creates cognitive load and stress, which is in turn its own burden on working memory. So the bottom line is it's very easy for kids to get overwhelmed when we ask them to write and not to be able to get the benefits of writing and also not learn to write well, by the way. So writing instruction has this potential power, but we first of all underestimated how hard it is. And secondly, we tried to teach it in isolation from the core content of the curriculum. And so we're not using it to build the knowledge we really want kids to acquire. So if we want to unlock its power, we need to do at least three things. We have to modulate that heavy cognitive load. And that could mean starting writing instruction at the sentence level, no matter what grade level kids are in, because if writing is hard, writing at length only makes it harder. Secondly, teach grammar and conventions in the context of students' own writing, which is for many kids the only thing that will work. And again, starting at the sentence level is going to make that easier because you don't have pages of error-filled prose to correct. And then thirdly, embed writing activities in the content of the curriculum. And I know of only one method that combines all three of those things, and that's the writing revolution. I'm the co-author of this book, but the method was devised by my co-author, Judith Hockman, a veteran educator who developed this over many years. And I see there are those hearts and things coming up. So there's some people out there who are familiar with it. But just to give you an idea of what this method looks like, a quick look. So it does start with sentence level activities. It doesn't end there, but it starts there. And one powerful sentence level activity is because, but, and so. This consists of giving students a sentence stem embedded ideally in the content they're learning about and having them finish it with each of these different conjunctions. So as an example, I'm using some content from the second grade CKLA curriculum on ancient India. And so you could give those second graders the following sentence stems. A civilization could form in the Indus River Valley because, but, and so. Now, obviously kids will need to already have some knowledge of the Indus River Valley to complete these sentence stems. And there are different ways they could complete them, but here are some possibilities. Because the fertile soil allowed people to stay in one place and grow crops, but first people had to figure out how to control floods from the river. So archaeologists have been able to uncover the remains of a city called Mohenjo-Daro. And as you can see, this is also a great way to reinforce vocabulary. And each of these responses requires students to retrieve a different kind of information from long-term memory and put it in their own words. And this is not a curriculum that has its own topics. The writing revolution is a method that is designed to be adapted to whatever curriculum you're teaching at any grade level, and by the way, in any subject matter. So across the curriculum, including math. So let's say you're teaching about decimals and fractions. You could use that same activity in math to build students' knowledge of those. And it's not taking away from math instruction, it's actually reinforcing it and facilitating it. And remember that complex syntax of written language that can be a barrier to reading comprehension. Well, teaching students how to use complex syntax in their own writing can really help with that. So let's go back to that Rachel Carson example and that phrase that made this kid think that these were three different people. That again is called an appositive. So what can we do about this? Well, one possibility would be to teach students what an appositive is using familiar content initially so that they don't have to juggle new content in working memory along with the concept of an appositive. And then after they've learned about Rachel Carson, give them this sentence to complete where they need to supply the appositive. And that is not only familiarizing them with this sentence structure, it's also deepening their knowledge of Rachel Carson. So this method goes beyond sentences all the way through argumentative essays, but it does crucially begin at the sentence level because that's what lays the foundation for independent writing at length. But outlines are also crucial because even if you know how to construct sentences, writing at length imposes a heavy cognitive load, thinking about what was I going to say next, or what did I already say? If you've got an outline to guide you, it makes it much easier. And writing an outline is itself a knowledge building activity and one that kids can engage in even before they've mastered sentence level work. So to give you a quick idea of how all of these things can come together, I'm going to show you an outline for a single paragraph that is part of the writing revolution method. Now, and this is embedded in content about Martin Luther King. So students are not just given a blank piece of paper or a form to fill out and told to fill out an outline. They will have been explicitly taught how to construct each part of the outline. So for example, this topic sentence uses an appositive, Martin Luther King Jr., a civil rights leader. And they will have been taught not only how to use an appositive, but that it can be a good way to construct a topic sentence. These notes, those are for their detail sentences. They will have been taught how to brainstorm details that relate to a topic sentence and how to put them in note form using symbols and abbreviations. And then for their concluding sentence, this begins with a subordinating conjunction, although Martin Luther King never saw segregation, and they will have been taught how to use subordinating conjunctions and that it can be a good way to construct a concluding sentence. Now, a student could stop here and will have really deepened their knowledge of Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement, even if they don't translate this into a finished paragraph. But if they do translate it into a finished paragraph, it's become a fairly easy task. They can just copy their topic and concluding sentences and convert their details to complete sentences, their notes, again, drawing on their sentence level skills to do that. And one of those skills will be using transition words and phrases to connect their thoughts and make their writing flow. And they will have been taught to do that perhaps in another context, building their knowledge of another body of knowledge. So that's how it can all come together. So effective writing instruction like this can turbocharge any content-rich curriculum, but if the curriculum is focused on those comprehension skills and strategies, it probably won't work, because if you're jumping from topic to topic, focusing on the skills rather than the content, students will probably not acquire enough information about any one topic to enable them to write coherently, even maybe a few sentences. So content-rich curriculum is the place to start. But I do want to return to this idea of, do we just need to add phonics? Is that what science tells us? And I hope that I've convinced you that science actually tells us we need to change a lot more than that about our current approach to literacy instruction. But here's some statistics, some evidence that I think helps illustrate why more phonics is not going to be enough. It has been found that racial and income-based gaps in test scores are actually larger for reading comprehension than for foundational skills. So even if we bring those kids up on foundational skills, there's still going to be gaps. And it's also been found that over 50% of struggling readers who achieve average decoding ability continue to struggle with reading. And for fluency, but a lot of that has to do with gaps in knowledge. And fluency is not just a pure skill. It has been called the bridge to comprehension, but whether you can fluently read something is going to also vary with your knowledge of the topic or your relevant knowledge. And then lastly, it's been pointed out that strong phonics instruction, when we've had periods of strong phonics instruction, that's been correlated with higher NAEP reading scores in 4th grade, but that doesn't carry over when those students reach 8th grade or 11th grade. Because if they've just been getting phonics without also getting access to academic knowledge and vocabulary, it's not going to be enough. So if we don't build all of these things simultaneously, we risk having many students not become fully literate. And also we risk that the pendulum swinging away from phonics once again. because, and this has happened in the past, if kids get to higher grade levels or they're expected to read and understand more complex text, teachers or phonics skeptics may say, well, they can decode this text, but they don't understand it. And that means that phonics doesn't work. Well, of course, that's not what it means, but that could be the interpretation placed on it. And then we could end up in a situation where kids can neither decode nor understand complex text. So as I mentioned, curriculum is the place to start, but I don't want to leave you with the impression that all you need to do is adopt a content-rich curriculum and you're going to be good to go. This is going to be very different for most teachers from what they are used to, and there could be some obstacles in the way of effective implementation. And one potential obstacle could be those standardized tests, because as I mentioned, they're not tied to any body of knowledge. And so you may know your kids know a lot about Greek myths, the human digestive system, whatever, and they have a lot of vocabulary related to those topics. But when they get to the test, the passages are about, the Inuit or Amelia Earhart, and they may not yet have acquired the critical mass of academic knowledge and vocabulary that will enable them to read and understand text on a wide range of topics. Now, that will happen eventually if they continue with the knowledge building curriculum, but we don't know at what point that will happen. So it could be easy to get discouraged if test scores don't start rising right away, but it's important to remember that doesn't mean the approach isn't working. It just means it takes more time. So these obstacles are not insurmountable, but teachers will need a few things for change to happen. One thing they're going to need, I think, is the why. Why is it important for change to happen? Because change is hard. And if teachers don't understand why we have to change, they may decide, well, I'm just going to stick with what's familiar and what's comfortable, and that's perfectly understandable. Once they've got the why, then they also need the what, a curriculum that provides them the materials to do their teaching. That's important, but even that's not enough, because there's also the how to deliver those materials effectively, how to adapt them to the particular needs of their students. And that could look like coaching, it could look like teachers collaborating, talking about what they're doing. And all of this is happening as we speak. This kind of change is happening. So these obstacles are really, they're not insurmountable. And I'd just like to close with an anecdote that to me illustrates the power of knowledge building curriculum, not only to enable students to achieve at a higher level, but also to change expectations. This was a story I heard when I was researching the book in Reno, Nevada, about a second grade teacher who's was giving a test to one of her students to determine his individual reading level. And he was a little boy who struggled like crazy with reading. And the teacher saw in the test kit, there was a text on the topic of westward expansion, which happened to be the topic the class had just spent 2 or 3 weeks learning about. But the text was on a 4th grade level, and this was a struggling 2nd grade reader. Just out of curiosity, the teacher handed the text to the boy, and to her surprise, he read it with 98% accuracy and 100% comprehension, which I think changed her concept of who that little boy was and what he could do. And it probably changed that little boy's concept of who he was as well. And I think that is one reason that we need to feel so much urgency about this, because we're making millions of kids maybe feel like they are failures, when in fact it's the system that has failed them. So I'm not going to read through this, but just to sum up, I will put these summaries here, and you can always contact me if you don't have time for a question today. Then you can always contact me through my website, and I do have a free newsletter called Minding the Gap. And thank you very much. And if there's time, I'm happy to try to take some questions.
Thank you so much, Natalie. That was incredible. I think we have a couple questions. Maybe we can try to squeeze one in here. I can answer one myself. Yes, we're going to be sharing the slides of the webinar as well as the recording link. You'll get that later this week. Let's see. Do you know, Natalie, if there's been any research on teachers, if a teacher innately uses more knowledge in their own teaching? Kind of a curious.
Yes, absolutely. There has been research on that. When teachers use more elevated vocabulary in their teaching, it has an effect on students' reading comprehension. I think of the study, but I can't think of the name of the person who did that. But of course, it also helps to read text that uses that elevated vocabulary, because it's going, that written language, not just the syntax, but also the vocabulary in written text has been found to be always higher than what we use in spoken language.
Yeah, and I'm sure this is sort of a silly aside, but I'm sure we've all been guilty of only ever having read a word and pronounced it the way we read it, as opposed to the way it's meant to be pronounced verbally. So I think we can all agree that we've experienced a little bit of that ourselves. We're at time, so I want to thank you again, Natalie, for joining us here today, and to all of you for joining us. This has really been a wonderful discussion and very informative, and we appreciate all of your time and attention. I want to again remind you all that you're going to be getting a recording link in a couple of days, as well as a certificate of attendance and a link to the presentation deck. And don't forget, we have lots more to share with you. We actually have a sister webinar coming up in just a couple of months about knowledge building in middle school. So be sure to check that out and visit our website, amplify.com/literacy-is-opportunity-series. Thank you all again so much for joining us, and have a wonderful rest of your day.